Number 12. Göbekli Tepe and the skulls carved to hang in the dark. In 2009, anthropologist Julia Gresky of the German Archaeological Institute began a slow, unglamorous task, cataloging human bone pulled from the fill of the oldest monumental architecture on Earth. The site was Göbekli Tepe, a ring of carved limestone pillars rising out of a dusty hill in southeastern Turkey, excavated by archaeologist Klaus Schmidt since the mid-1990s. Roughly 700 fragments of human bone came out of that rubble. More than half were skulls. 3 of those fragments didn't look like the others. They had been cut. Deep grooves ran front to back along the curve of the cranium, gouged in with flint tools. And on the best preserved piece, something else, a drilled hole near the crown, about 5 millimeters across, with faint traces of red ochre still clinging to the edge. Gresky published the analysis in Science Advances in 2017, working with Julia Helm and Lee Clare. Using microscopic techniques, they ruled out animal gnawing. They ruled out scalping. The cuts were too deep, too deliberate for that. And critically, the grooves had been carved into bone that was already stripped of flesh. These weren't wounds. They were modifications, made carefully after death. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe are roughly 11,000 years old. That predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It predates the pyramids by 7,000. It predates pottery, writing, the wheel. The people who carved these skulls hadn't even invented farming yet. Here's where it turns dark. That drilled hole sat exactly where a cord would need to pass for the skull to hang. Level, balanced, face forward. The bone had been prepared to be suspended. From a beam, perhaps. A post. Or one of the great T-shaped pillars itself. The carved imagery at the site seems to echo it. One statue is missing its head, apparently on purpose. Another, the gift bearer, cradles a human head in its hands. We like to imagine the deep past as a slow climb towards sophistication, with ritual and meaning arriving late after the harvests and the cities. Göbekli Tepe turns that story upside down. Before farming, before permanent villages, before any marker we use to define civilization, human beings were hauling 20-ton pillars into place and curating the skulls of their dead, cleaning them, marking them, hanging them in the air. Honored ancestors, kept close, or enemies, put on grim display. The evidence can't tell us yet. The carvings are crude and hurried, which somehow makes it worse, not better. They left no words, only the grooves, the single drilled hole, and the certainty that the dead were meant to be seen. We do not know by whom. We do not know why. And we do not know what those suspended faces were meant to watch over from their place above the oldest temple in the world. Number 11. The city of Jericho and the faces they rebuilt out of plaster. In 1953, British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon was digging through the deepest layers of Tel es Sultan, the great mound beside the springs of Jericho in the Jordan Valley. She'd reached strata laid down before pottery, before the plow. A Neolithic world, 9,500 years old. There, in the dirt beneath where houses once stood, she found 7 human skulls. Each one had been given back its face. The flesh was long gone, of course. What Kenyon's team uncovered was the work done after the flesh was gone. The lower jaw removed. The empty cranium packed with soil to support the delicate facial bones. And then, wet plaster modeled over the front of the skull, sculpted into cheeks. A nose, a brow, the structure of a living human face. The eye sockets were filled with cowrie shells, set into the plaster so the skull seemed to look back at whoever held it. Some carried traces of red and black paint. Some had hair painted on. The most famous now sits in the British Museum, considered the oldest portrait in the collection. The man it portrays had his head deliberately reshaped in infancy, bound, flattened, marking him as set apart from childhood. Kenyon thought she was looking at a portrait of someone who had lived and died thousands of years before her. She wasn't wrong. More than 50 of these plastered skulls have since been found across the Neolithic Near East. The practice was widespread. It was patient. It lasted for generations. At Jericho, people buried their family members beneath the floors of their own homes. They lived directly on top of their dead. And sometimes, after the body had decomposed below, they went back down, retrieved the skull, brought it up to be remade, to be displayed, to be kept. The dead weren't sent away. They were curated, furnished with new faces. seated among the living, looking out through shells. We talk about ancestor worship as an abstraction, a category in a textbook. Jericho makes it physical. These weren't symbols. They were the actual heads of actual grandparents and parents, dug up, sculpted, painted, and placed where the family could see them every day. The work is tender. The care taken with each face is obvious. And that tenderness is exactly what disturbs, because it means the boundary we draw so firmly between the living and the dead, the boundary that lets us bury someone and walk away, simply wasn't there. The shells stare out of the plaster, blind, patient, from the springs of one of the oldest cities humanity ever built. Whose faces these were meant to be is lost to us. What survives is the care of someone who loved them enough to give them back. Number 10, the Chinchorro and the bodies they took apart to keep forever. Along the coast of the Atacama Desert, in what is now northern Chile and southernmost Peru, lived a people who made the oldest deliberately preserved human bodies on Earth. We call them the Chinchorro. They weren't kings or priests with great tombs. They were hunter-gatherers and fishermen. Roughly 7,000 years ago, some 2,000 years before the first Egyptian mummy, they began doing something to their dead that no one before them is known to have done. Chilean physical anthropologist Bernardo Arriaza of the University of Tarapacá has spent decades reconstructing how. The process wasn't preservation as we picture it. It was disassembly and reconstruction, the body taken apart, organs removed. Soft tissue stripped, sometimes the skin peeled away entirely, set aside for later, the skeleton reinforced from the inside with sticks, reeds, clay, rebuilt into a standing armature of a human being, the skin reattached, the face covered with a clay mask, the whole figure coated in the earliest style with black manganese paste, later, after 4,500 years, with brilliant red ochre. These are the oldest artificial mummies in the world. They predate the pharaohs by millennia. UNESCO only recognized the Chinchorro sites in 2021, validating what specialists had argued for a generation, that a small band of desert fishermen had built one of the most elaborate mortuary technologies in human prehistory. But here's where the familiar image, mummies as the privilege of the powerful, falls apart. The Chinchorro mummified everyone, men, women, the elderly, and above all, the very young, newborns, infants. Even unborn fetuses received the full, painstaking treatment. There was no hierarchy in it. And Arriaza has a theory that turns the whole practice from morbid craft into something almost unbearably human. The rivers in this region, particularly around the Camerones Valley, carried naturally high levels of arsenic. Arsenic causes miscarriage. It kills infants. These communities were burying their children at devastating rates. His argument, mummification, began as grief. It began with parents who couldn't bear to let go, who painted their dead children, dressed them, kept them present, and the technique grew more elaborate over centuries because the loss never stopped. The mummies weren't sealed away. They were maintained, repainted when the color faded, even repaired, carried on reed litters to remain present among the living. A dead child wasn't removed from the family. A dead child was kept. We invented mummification. It turns out, not for god kings reaching for eternity, but for ordinary people who had lost too many of their own. The oldest preserved bodies on the planet are mostly small ones. They stand now in museum cases in the driest desert in the world. Black and red and silent, the faces of children whose parents refused 7,000 years ago to say goodbye. Number 9, Çatalhöyük, and the houses built on top of the dead. In 1958, on a plain in central Anatolia, archaeologist James Millart began uncovering one of the earliest large settlements humans ever built, a honeycomb of mud brick houses packed so tight there were no streets between them. People entered through holes in the roof, walked across the rooftops of the entire town. We call it Çatalhöyük. At its height, between 7,000 and 6,000 BCE, it held thousands of people. Decades later, from 1993 to 2018, British archaeologist Ian Hodder led a long, meticulous re-excavation and revealed what these people did with their dead. They kept them in the house. At Çatalhöyük, the dead were buried beneath the floors, under the raised platforms where the living slept, a body placed in a pit, dug into the home's floor, sometimes after the flesh had already decayed elsewhere, and then the family went on living above it. In one building, Hodder's team found the remains of around 20 individuals beneath a single floor. These houses, occupied by the living, were also tombs. The two functions weren't kept apart. They were the same thing. And then, the skulls. As at Jericho, the people here sometimes returned to a buried body, removed the head, brought it back into circulation. In 2004, excavators found the single plastered, painted skull ever recovered from the site, cradled in the arms of another body. An older woman buried holding the remade head of someone who had died before her. The skull had been passed down. It had outlived at least one generation, placed at last in the embrace of the next. The walls were stranger still. Set into them, plastered over, often painted red with ochre, were the horned skulls of wild aurochs, enormous now extinct cattle, their horns projecting straight into the living space. Archaeologists call these installations bucrania. A family might share its main room with rows of bull horns thrusting from the walls, and the skulls of the human dead beneath the floor. A single, continuous environment of the living, the slaughtered, and the ancestral. Hodder has argued certain houses function as what he calls history houses, dwellings where the dead were concentrated, where skulls were retrieved, achieved, and handed down, where a lineage's identity was physically anchored in the building itself. To belong somewhere was to live on top of your dead, surrounded by the heads of bulls and grandparents, in a house that remembered. There's no separation here that we'd recognize, no graveyard at the edge of town, no threshold between where you sleep and where the dead lie. The people of Çatalhöyük built their lives directly onto the bodies of those they'd lost, decorated the walls with the dead of two species, passed the skulls of their ancestors from one set of arms to the next, across the generations. Whatever they understood about the dead, it didn't involve letting them leave. Number 8, Herxheim and the 500 who were broken into pieces. In 1996, in the Palatinate region of southwestern Germany, a construction project broke ground and began turning up human bone. The site was Herxheim. What emerged over the following years, through a rescue excavation led by Andrea Zeeb and Fabian Hock, is one of the most contested deposits in all of European prehistory. It dates to around 5000 BCE, the very end of what archaeologists call the linear pottery culture, the first farmers of Central Europe. The remains belong to a minimum of 500 individuals. Some estimates run past 1,000. They weren't laid out in graves. They had been shattered, scattered through pits that ringed the settlement, mixed together, fragmented, deliberately reduced. Newborns, children, adults, the elderly, an entire cross-section of human beings, broken apart and deposited. In 2009, anthropologist Bruno Bulliston published an analysis in the journal Antiquity that named what the bones appeared to show. The skulls had been worked into a recurring, standardized form, what researchers describe as skull caps. The long bones broken open, the way one breaks bone to extract marrow, cut marks consistent with the removal of muscle, damage matching how ribs are separated from the spine in butchery. The treatment of the human bodies, Bullistin argued, closely matched the treatment of butchered animals at the same site. His conclusion? Cannibalism. Mass cannibalism carried out over perhaps only a few decades. To grasp the scale, look at the pottery found among the bones. Some came from places up to 400 kilometers away. People or bodies or both converging on this one location from across an enormous stretch of Neolithic Europe. The interpretation, though, is fiercely contested. That has to be said. Other researchers, Jörg Orschiet, Miriam Heidel, argue the damage need not mean cannibalism at all. It could represent an intense, violent form of secondary burial, bodies carried from far away, processed, and ritually deposited as part of some funerary crisis response, without anyone consuming them. The bones can be read more than one way, but the disagreement doesn't dissolve the strangeness, it deepens it. Because under either reading, something extraordinary was happening at Herxheim. At the exact moment the first farming culture of Europe collapsed, either hundreds of people were consumed in a sustained ritual, or hundreds of bodies were carried across a continent to be smashed into fragments and laid in pits. Neither is ordinary, neither is gentle. What remains are the pits, the standardized skull caps, the bones of 500 human beings, broken with the same care one uses on an animal. They were processed by people who knew exactly what they were doing. The knowing is the part that stays with you. Number 7. Cahokia's Mound 72 and the women who were buried by the dozen. Across the Mississippi River from modern St. Louis once stood the largest city in North America, north of Mexico. We call it Cahokia. 1,000 years ago, it was a metropolis of earthen pyramids and tens of thousands of people. In the 1960s, archaeologist Melvin Fowler excavated one of its smaller mounds, a low ridge designated Mound 72. What he found inside is among the clearest evidence of large-scale human sacrifice anywhere in the ancient Americas. At the heart of the mound lay two central individuals, placed on a bed of more than 20,000 marine shell beads arranged in the shape of a bird, the famous beaded burial. For decades, this was read as the grave of a great male warrior chief and his companion. More recent analysis, led by Thomas Emerson in 2016, complicated that story considerably. The central pairing includes a man and a woman. The surrounding high-status burials include both sexes and a child. But it's what lay around these central figures that turns the stomach. In separate pits within the same mound, mass graves. One held more than 50 young women, laid out in neat rows. Another held people who'd died violently. Some bled to death, some decapitated, thrown in without ceremony. The young women, ages 15 to 25, showed no marks on the bone to reveal how they died, which itself points toward methods that leave no trace. Strangulation, perhaps, poisoning, or the cutting of the throat. In a single mound, in a society without writing or metal tools, hundreds of people had been killed and arranged around a handful of elites. And it wasn't a single catastrophic event. The neatly ordered graves represent a practice repeated generation after generation. Then the chemistry changed the meaning entirely. Researchers analyzed strontium isotopes in the teeth of the dead, a geological fingerprint that marks where a person grew up. For a long time, it was assumed the victims were outsiders, captives, tribute, strangers brought in to die. The isotopes said otherwise. The young women were, for the most part, local. They'd grown up in and around Cahokia itself. This wasn't the killing of enemies. These were the city's own daughters, raised within sight of the mounds, selected, killed, and buried by the dozen, in service of a ritual whose meaning died with the city. We cannot ask them what they were told it was for. We can only count the rows. More than 50 young women in a single pit who grew up in the greatest city their continent had ever produced and were buried by it. Number 6, Pummelty, and the bodies thrown into the shafts. In 1991, an aerial photograph of farmland in Saxony-Anhalt, eastern Germany, revealed the ghost of an enormous circular structure pressed into the soil. Concentric rings of ditches, banks, and post holes, more than 100 meters across. It came to be called the German Stonehenge, properly the Reinheiligtum Pummelte, built around the same time as the Great Stone Circle in England, roughly 4,300 years ago. Like Stonehenge, it was a place of ritual, not a place to live, a place where things were given to the earth. From 2005 to 2008, excavations led by André Spazier investigated 29 shaft-like pits sunk into the ground within the rings. In the earliest phase, dated to around 2300 BCE, the pits had been filled with deliberately broken objects, smashed drinking vessels, stone axes, grinding stones, the butchered bones of cattle, all destroyed before being thrown in. This was a place where you broke valuable things on purpose and committed them to the dark. And among the broken pottery and smashed axes, people. The shafts held the dismembered bodies of 10 women and children. They hadn't been buried. They'd been thrown in. Their remains arranged in the contorted positions of bodies that fell or were dropped rather than laid to rest. Most were between 3 and 17 years old. 4 showed severe fractures to the skull and ribs, injuries sustained at or near the time of death. 1 teenager had been bound, hands tied together before the body went into the pit. To understand what that means, look at the other side of the monument. In the eastern half, excavators found a different kind of burial entirely. 13 adult men interred carefully, formally, skulls oriented toward the rising sun. The men were given dignity, laid out facing the sunrise. The women and children were broken and discarded into shafts. alongside the ritually smashed pottery, treated in death as offerings, not as people to be mourned. The researchers are careful. It remains unclear whether these individuals were ritually sacrificed or died in some episode of raiding and violence and were deposited here afterward. But the contrast is the thing that haunts. The same community that buried its men facing the dawn threw its women and children into pits with the trash of a broken feast. Certain human beings, it seems, were valuables to be destroyed, no different in kind from a shattered cup or a slaughtered cow. For 4,000 years, it lay invisible beneath a field. When it was opened again, the shafts gave up their offerings. A bound teenager, people with shattered skulls, 10 women and children face down in the dark beside the broken things. Number 5, Sungyur and the children buried like gods. About 150 kilometers east of Moscow lies one of the most extraordinary burials of the Ice Age. The site is called Sungyur, excavated between 1957 and 1977 under Soviet archaeologist Otto Bader. The remains date to around 34,000 years ago, deep in the Upper Paleolithic, when this was open mammoth steppe and the people who lived here hunted enormous animals in a frozen land. In one long, narrow grave, those hunters buried 2 children with a wealth that defies comprehension. The 2 were placed head to head, skull touching skull, perhaps 10 and 12 years old, covered, quite literally, in treasure. Across their 2 small bodies, more than 10,000 beads carved from mammoth ivory, sewn so densely they must have once covered entire garments. More than 20 ivory armbands, around 300 pierced fox teeth, a belt strung with the canines of some 250 Arctic foxes, carved ivory animals, an ivory mammoth pendant, 2 human thigh bones packed with red ochre laid across the children's chests, and then the spears, 16 lances of mammoth ivory beside the bodies, the longest nearly 2.5 meters, made from a tusk that had somehow been straightened, a curved tusk worked into a straight shaft, a feat of craft we still don't fully understand. Consider the labor. Experimental estimates suggest a single ivory bead took 45 minutes to an hour to carve. 10,000 beads, thousands of hours, months of human effort by skilled hands in a brutal climate where survival was never guaranteed, poured into the graves of 2 children. And then there's the question of who these children were. Studied in detail by Eric Trinkhaus and Alexandra Bujilova, the analysis showed both were physically disabled. One had thigh bones severely bowed, abnormally short. The other appears to have been bedridden, possibly from birth. The teeth show almost no wear, hinting the group had been feeding this child soft food, keeping a profoundly disabled member of the band alive year after year. Meanwhile, an adult man buried at the same site, a man who could hunt, who could provide, went into the ground with a fraction of the riches. This overturns a comfortable assumption about the Ice Age, that status had to be earned, that the weak were left behind, that only the strong were honored. At Sungyur, the opposite is written in ivory. 2 children who couldn't hunt, who could barely move, who in some grim calculus were a burden on a struggling band, were sent into death wrapped in more wealth than anyone else at the site. They weren't abandoned, they were exalted. 34,000 years ago, in the cold, human beings looked at 2 disabled children and decided they were worth everything they had. Number 4, Shanidar and the Neanderthals, who would not leave their dead. In a cave in the Zagros Mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan, between 1951 and 1960, American archaeologist Ralph Selecki uncovered the remains of 10 Neanderthals, men, women, infants, who had died there tens of thousands of years ago. The site is called Shanidar. One individual, designated Shanidar 4, would become the most famous Neanderthal burial ever found, and the spark for an argument that hasn't ended in more than half a century. Around the body, the soil told a strange story. When paleobotanist Arlette Leroy-Gourhan analyzed pollen samples from the grave, she found whole clumps of it, from several species of flowering plants, concentrated around the body, not the scattered pollen you'd expect blown into a cave. Selecki drew the conclusion that captured the world's imagination. The Neanderthals, he proposed, had laid this man to rest on a bed of flowers. They had grieved. They had performed a funeral. The implication detonated a stereotype. Neanderthals, imagined as brutish, barely human, had buried their dead with tenderness, with ceremony. It happened roughly 70,000 years ago, tens of thousands of years before our own species would paint a cave wall in Europe. But here, certainty gives way to serious doubt. Critics pointed out that pollen can be carried into a cave by burrowing rodents. A Persian jerd hoarding seeds could produce exactly such clumps. The evidence that moved the world might be the work of a small mammal, or a worker's boot. That has to be granted. So a new generation went back. From 2014, a team led by Graham Barker reopened Seleki's old trench. In 2016, paleoanthropologist Emma Pomeroy found something no one expected: the crushed skull and torso of another Neanderthal, lying directly beside where Shanidar 4 had been lifted out decades earlier. They named the individual Shanidar Z. The new excavation suggested these bodies had been placed in a channel deliberately dug deeper into the cave floor. A prominent rock beside the head may have served as a marker, a place returned to again and again across years. The flowers may never be proven, but the deeper truth survived the doubt. Whatever the pollen was, the Neanderthals of Shanidar were carrying their dead to a particular place, digging to receive them, marking the spot, coming back. They had a place for the dead. They returned to it. We share roughly 2% of our DNA with these people. In some sense, they never fully left us. What Shanidar suggests is that the refusal to abandon the dead, the thread running through this entire list, may be older than our species, may belong to a different kind of human who grieved in a language we will never hear, in the dark of a cave 70,000 years gone. Number 3. The Pit of Bones and the oldest funeral we have ever found. In the Atapuerca hills of north-central Spain, deep inside a cave system reached only by crawling through narrow passages and descending a vertical shaft 13 meters straight down, there's a chamber. Archaeologists call the Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones. It may hold evidence of mortuary ritual so ancient it reaches back beyond our own species, beyond the Neanderthals, to a human ancestor who lived nearly 500,000 years ago. At the bottom of that shaft, excavators have recovered the remains of at least 28 individuals, Homo heidelbergensis, an archaic human near the root of the Neanderthal line. The bones date to around 430,000 years old. Our own species wouldn't exist for another 100,000 years after these people died. How did 28 bodies come to rest at the bottom of a sealed vertical shaft, in a place no one would casually fall into, where no animal would naturally drag prey? The composition points away from accident. Very few infants, very few elderly. The assemblage dominated by adolescents and young adults, not the pattern of a death trap, but the pattern of selection. The completeness of the skeletons suggests the bodies arrived whole, as corpses, not scattered, scavenged remains. These bodies were deliberately placed there, carried or dropped down the shaft on purpose. And then, the single most evocative object in all of human prehistory. Among hundreds of thousands of bones, excavators found exactly one stone tool. One, a beautifully made hand axe, worked on both faces, carved from a rare reddish quartzite that doesn't match the ordinary stone of the site. They named it Excalibur. Researchers argued that the deliberate placement of the bodies, combined with this one exceptional object of striking color, points to symbolic behavior. The earliest mortuary practice in the human record, pushing the origins of ritual back some 300,000 years earlier than almost anyone had been willing to believe. A grave offering, a single beautiful thing, chosen for its color, given to the dead before our species was even born. This is, of course, contested. Some argue the chamber could have been a natural trap, that the axe could have arrived by chance. The doubt is fair. The proof is gone, dissolved by 400 millennia. But look at what's required to dismiss it. 28 bodies carried into the deepest dark, dominated by the young, accompanied by one perfect red axe, and nothing else. If that is meaningless, it's a meaninglessness that looks exactly like grief. Nearly 500,000 years ago, something that was not yet us may have looked at its dead and refused to let them go without a gift. Number 2, Dolní Věstonice and the 3 who were buried touching. In the spring of 1986, near a village in Moravia, Archaeologist Bohuslav Klima uncovered a grave that has refused explanation for nearly 40 years. It belongs to the Gravettian period, around 30,000 years ago, in the era of the great mammoth hunters of Ice Age Europe. 3 young people, buried together, arranged in a tableau so deliberate, every attempt to read it has only deepened the riddle, all between 16 and 25 years old. The individual on the left lay on his back, head turned toward the center body, hand placed deliberately across the central figure's pelvis. The body in the center lay on its back. The individual on the right lay face down, turned away, arm reaching toward the others. Red ochre, the pigment that recurs across human burial, scattered over the heads of all 3. Concentrated heavily over the pelvis of the figure in the middle. That central figure is the heart of the mystery. This person's skeleton shows a genetic pathology, legs curved and malformed, bones marked by other anomalies. Someone who would have looked different in life. For a long time, the central figure was believed to be a woman, which gave rise to the interpretations that have haunted the site: a love triangle frozen in death, or a childbirth gone fatally wrong. There's even a wooden stake driven through the hip of the figure on the left. The modern evidence dismantles those old stories and leaves something stranger in their place. A 1997 kinship study found all 3 shared a cluster of rare anatomical traits, unlikely to co-occur by chance, almost certainly related. An Ice Age family laid to rest as one. Then ancient DNA complicated it further, suggesting all 3 may in fact have been male, collapsing the love triangle entirely. 3 related young men, 1 disabled, buried touching, drenched in ochre, 1 face down with a stake through his hip. We are left holding a scene we know was meaningful and cannot decode. The hand on the pelvis was placed by someone. The face down body turned by someone. The ochre poured by someone. The stake driven by someone. 30,000 years ago, people stood over this grave and arranged 3 young bodies into a specific intentional composition. Then they covered it over, and the meaning went into the ground with them. The hand still rests on the pelvis, the face is still turned away. We can see exactly what they did in perfect detail. We will never learn what it meant. Number 1, Mungo Lady and the fire on the far side of the world. In 1968, geologist Jim Bowler was riding a motorbike across the eroding dunes of a long dry lake bed in the far west of New South Wales, studying ancient climate written in the sediment. The place is called Lake Mungo. In the crumbling wall of a dune, Bowler saw fragments of burnt bone weathering out of the earth. He had found a woman. We call her Mungo Lady. She would turn out to be the oldest cremation ever discovered anywhere on the planet. Her body had been burned. Then her bones had been crushed. Then the crushed remains had been gathered and buried in the earth. This wasn't a body left to the elements. This was a deliberate, multi-stage funerary rite carried out with intention and care. Years later, in 1974, Bowler found a second burial 500 meters away. Mungo Man, an older man laid out on his back, hands folded at his lap, body sprinkled head to foot with red ochre. In 2003, researchers published a careful consensus on the age of these 2 burials, drawing on 4 dating methods and decades of stratigraphic work. Mungo Lady and Mungo Man are roughly 40,000 to 42,000 years old. Hold that against everything else on this list. Mungo Lady's cremation predates Göbekli Tepe by 30,000 years. It is the oldest cremation on Earth. And here's the detail that should stop you cold. These rites were performed on the far side of the planet from every site we've walked through tonight. While the ancestors of the people who would one day build Jericho and Sungur were still scattered across Africa and Asia, here, in the heart of Australia, 40,000 years ago, human beings were already cremating their dead, already grinding red ochre to anoint the body, already standing over a grave with the full weight of ceremony, and the truth of it isn't its strangeness, it's its familiarity. Everything else on this list has confronted us with rituals we cannot fully understand. Skulls hung from posts, bodies thrown into shafts, children buried under fortunes of ivory. This is something else. This is the recognition that the things we still do, burning our dead, gathering the ashes, marking a body with color, laying it down with care, are not recent inventions. They are not the product of religion or cities or writing. They are older than all of that. nearly as old as our species' presence on this continent. You have almost certainly stood at a graveside. You may have watched a body committed to fire, or carried ashes somewhere that mattered. When you did, you weren't performing a modern act. You were doing something a woman's people did for her on the shore of a lake in Australia 42,000 years ago, burning her, gathering her, returning her to the earth, because they could not bear to let her vanish without ceremony. Across every site we have walked through tonight, across 500,000 years and the entire surface of the earth, the same thing keeps appearing in the ground. People who would not abandon their dead. It is the one thread that runs unbroken through the whole of the human past, older than farming, older than language as we know it, older, very nearly, than we are. Mungo Lady is the proof, lying in the red dust at the bottom of the world. The fire was lit 42,000 years ago, and in some quiet, essential way, it has never gone out. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.